In the final of the 2007 NCAA tournament, the Ohio State Buckeyes, led by freshmen Greg Oden and Mike Conley, matched up against the defending champion Florida Gators. It was exactly the kind of game that you want from a national championship. Pretty much all of Florida's team from the year before came back to get to this exact moment, including future NBA stars Al Horford and Joakim Noah. Ohio State were in pretty much the exact opposite scenario, relying heavily on their two star freshmen, Oden especially, to lead them through the season. Oden had been the consensus #1 recruit in the country in 2006, and along with Kevin Durant at Texas, was absolutely destroying his first year in college basketball. So that's how we got to this point. But here's the thing about that game. These guys were there because they wanted to be. They'd made that clear when they all decided to come back for another season. But for a very different reason, these guys were there because they had to be. And unpacking why is going to take a minute. In the early to mid-2000s, the top of the NBA draft started to feature more and more players who were coming straight out of high school. Nobody wanted to miss out on the next Kobe Bryant or Kevin Garnett, and with the growth of AAU basketball and greater access to scouting information, more teams were starting to at least entertain the idea of taking on the inherent risk that came from drafting an 18-year-old. All of this sort of peaked in 2001, when 3 of the top 4 picks in the draft, Kwame Brown, Tyson Chandler, and Eddie Curry, were taken right out of high school. More followed in 2002, and 2003, and 2004, but for every LeBron James or Amari Stoudemire, there was a Jonathan Bender, or a Sebastian Telfair, or Robert Swift. Turns out that it can actually be kind of hard to project what kind of an NBA player an 18-year-old is going to turn into. So, in order to protect themselves against the risk of that happening again in the future, the NBA's teams came up with a plan. And boy, was it something. In 2005, the NBA and its Players Association negotiated a new collective bargaining agreement, which featured a very key compromise. The players wanted and got a slightly increased share in the league's revenue, but in order for that to happen, they agreed to raise the required age to enter the league to 19. On the surface, it seemed like a win for everyone. NBA teams could get more mature players coming into the draft, and college basketball could get the benefit of having the top players play for their schools, at least for a little while. And while some prospects did choose to go play overseas or go straight to the D-League every once in a while, the general consensus was that if they wanted to get the kind of exposure they needed to move up draft boards, the big players needed to go to a big school. And thus, the one-and-done rule was born, and even if absolutely no one asked for it, it's fundamentally changed the makeup of college basketball and the NBA for the entirety of its existence. Whenever there's a big policy change or a new trend that's taking over a particular space, there will always be people who jump on the bandwagon quicker than others. These people are the early adopters, the ones who get in on the ground floor, who lean into a change rather than resist it. And in the case of the one-and-done rule, no one exemplifies that idea better than John Calipari. Most people jump straight to Calipari's time at Kentucky when this kind of thing comes up, but his strategy of leaning heavily on star freshmen, who were likely headed for the draft, actually goes back to when he was coaching at Memphis. Derrick Rose got the Tigers all the way to the national title game in 2008, just a couple of months before getting picked first overall in the draft. Tyreke Evans went 4th the next year after his one season. But when Billy Gillispie got fired at Kentucky in 2009, it was time for Coach Cal to take his strategy, which he'd shown proof of concept of at Memphis, and supercharge it at one of the biggest programs in the entire country.
There's 3 keys to winning championships. The first thing is have really good players. The second thing is have really good players. And I hate to tell you, that's the third thing. So we've got to go out, look at who's out there. I'm here because I can recruit the best of the best here. That's why I'm here.
With the resources and pedigree now available to him at Kentucky, Calipari was able to sell his vision to the top prospects in every recruiting class from all over the country every single year. Almost as soon as he got to Lexington, Calipari was able to convince both John Wall and DeMarcus Cousins to switch their commitments to the Wildcats. Oh, and Eric Bledsoe was there too, just for good measure. 35 wins and an Elite Eight appearance later, Calipari's team proved that the haters, of whom there were quite a few, but we'll get to that in a minute, were not going to keep Kentucky from trying to game the system. The next year, they did the exact same thing, bringing in Brandon Knight, Terrence Jones, and Deron Lamb to get them to Kentucky's first Final Four since 1998. But it was the next season, in 2011, when the Calipari project really peaked, because the big prize in that recruiting class was a 6'10" big out of Chicago who could handle like a guard, named Anthony Davis. Along with fellow five-stars Michael Kidd-Gilchrist and Marquise Teague, Davis led Kentucky to a 38-2 record and a win in the national title game against Kansas. It was Calipari's first and, to this point, only national title, but more importantly, it was definitive proof that his team-building strategy could win big under the right circumstances. But just because it was effective didn't mean that it was popular. Bob Knight was far from the only one that openly criticized Calipari and Kentucky during this period, but he was probably the most pointed. Knight won 3 national titles and over 600 games as the head coach of Indiana, but in his words, the thing that he was most proud of in that time was his program's graduation rates. In Calipari's Kentucky, well, they just weren't doing that.
In college basketball, that just really bothers me beyond anything that's ever bothered me in my career, and that's this idea. Kentucky, year before last, started 5 players in the NCAA tournament games that had not been to class that semester. And that's that one and done philosophy.
Now, I don't know if that part about guys going to class is true, but it doesn't sound great, does it? For people who thought like Bobby Knight, and believe me, there were plenty, Calipari's apparent disregard for the college part of college basketball messed with the integrity of the entire exercise. Calipari didn't exactly endear himself to those critics with comments like these, but honestly, why would he care? His team was on top, and as long as he had the market cornered on these one-and-done guys, it looked like he was going to stay there. But what if other big teams also started to embrace one-and-done? In 2014, for the first time in a while, it was not Kentucky at the top of the national recruiting rankings. Mike Krzyzewski's Duke had the best group of freshmen in the entire country that year, including Freshman of the Year Jahlil Okafor and soon-to-be first-round picks Justice Winslow and Tyus Jones. And Kentucky had Karl Anthony Towns and Devin Booker, so it wasn't exactly like they were hurting in that department, but by then, we expected that kind of thing from them. Duke had been the symbol of the exact opposite of this whole thing for so long, recruiting freshmen, as a Washington Post article from 2019 puts it, expressly so they could develop into juniors and seniors. When Corey Maggette left after his freshman year in 1999, Coach K publicly criticized that decision. Even a player as talented as Grant Hill, who today would almost certainly be a one-and-done candidate, stayed in college for all 4 years, because that's just what you did at Duke. So how did this guy, the man who just kind of shrugged off the one-and-done rule when it came into effect, build this team 10 years later? The impact of a big decision like one and done comes in stages, and this is the stage where other teams who might have resisted the idea of one and done initially, or just took a while to figure it out, started to catch up to the early adopters. Duke was still really good after the initial advent of one and done, but they weren't doing as well as consistently. And for someone as competitive as Coach K, that's a problem. He tried unsuccessfully to recruit John Wall in 2009, but did manage to bring in Kyrie Irving in the next cycle, and from pretty much that point forward, Duke was a permanent major player in the one-and-done market. But things didn't really hit critical mass until 2015, when Coach K finally found the right formula for winning big with freshmen. That Final Four was a fascinating clash of cultures, with the one-and-done armies of Duke and Kentucky meeting up with the much more experienced pair of Michigan State and Wisconsin. 3 of Duke's top 5 scorers that season were freshmen, the same 3 guys that I mentioned earlier, and Kentucky's Karl Anthony Towns, who would go on to be the first pick in the draft a couple months later, had helped put them in the position to be the first men's Division I basketball team to go undefeated since 1976. You can make the argument that this was the peak of the one-and-done era, a masterpiece in development and adaptation from Mike Krzyzewski, one that I don't think gets nearly enough credit. He says now that he just didn't realize that those players wanted to come to Duke, but in any case, he's far from the only coach that's adapted either a little or a lot to remain competitive. Bill Self's 2008 Kansas team, who coincidentally beat John Calipari's Memphis in the national title game, didn't have a single freshman on it that averaged 10 minutes per game, and didn't feature any players who'd go on to get picked in the top 10 of the draft. This team was sort of the platonic ideal of the pre-one-and-done era, but 6 years later, Kansas put out a group of players who were pretty much the exact opposite of that. 2014 Kansas had 3 different freshmen average more than 20 minutes a game, and 2 of those guys, Andrew Wiggins and Joel Embiid, were taken in the top 3 picks of the draft that summer. And look, the purists out there will probably point out that the team of veterans won the national title while the team full of freshmen got bounced in the second round, and that is a fair point, but I mention all of that not necessarily to demonstrate the effectiveness of leaning into one and done, but instead how many major programs have completely altered their strategies to accommodate it. The idea of being a one-and-done destination has evolved significantly over the 15 or so years that the rule has been in place, with more schools getting in on the action and carving out their own little niche in that space as time has gone on. But while the spirit of one-and-done still very much survives in 2023, the rule itself is a bit of an endangered species. Let's look back at the premise that started all of this. In the mid-2000s, the NBA recognized what it believed to be a problem, which was younger high school players being too risky compared to older college ones, and then they implemented a solution to try and fix that problem. This was a bold idea that would have decades-long implications, but just because it was impactful doesn't mean that it worked. In my mind, you can only judge how effective a big change like this was from the results it produced, so let's take a look at those, starting with that national title game in 2007. This is just one example, but from that Ohio State team that made the final, you had Greg Oden, Mike Conley, and Daquan Cook all going in the first round of the NBA draft. So how did these grizzled college veterans do in the league after their one season in Columbus? One of them did pretty dang well. Mike Conley has played 15 plus seasons in the NBA and has over 90 career win shares at the time of recording. He's also one of the greatest Memphis Grizzlies of all time, which is something that these other two guys will never even get close to. Daquan Cook bounced around the NBA for a few seasons, mostly as a bench guy, and Greg Oden, well, the less said about his NBA career relative to the expectations, the better. Suffice it to say that based on this case alone, going to college for a year was not some magical amplifier of future success. But that's just one example. To get a feel for the overall effects of one and done on college basketball and the NBA as a whole, we need to look at a lot more data. In 2022, CJ Moore of The Athletic did a 5-part series on recruiting called Finding Gems, where he looked at some of the ways that college basketball coaches have tried to gain an advantage in recruiting as the rules around it have evolved. One of those ways is looking at a player's age. Older players may have developed better by the time they get into college, but the idea that their higher floors makes them safer than a younger player isn't necessarily borne out in the data. For that article, Moore looked at every single recruiting class from the time one and done was implemented back in 2005 all the way up to 2022, and what he found was really interesting. Moore separated the data into two groups by the date each player was born relative to a school calendar, beginning in the middle of August. And of the 368 players that made the NBA from those classes, which Moore defines as having played in 82 games or more, 208 of them, or about 57%, were born after January 1st. Now, that's not a huge difference, and may not confirm that drafting young guys is the way to go, but it also definitely doesn't confirm the NBA's idea that older players are going to be better pros, which again is the entire basis of the one and done rule. And it doesn't stop there. Of the 5-star recruits in those classes, so the guys who would be the most likely to get drafted after 1 year in college, players born after January 1st, so the younger ones, had a 76% chance of playing at least one season's worth of NBA games, while players born before had a 56% chance to do the same. Younger players from those recruiting classes have had a greater chance of not only making it to the NBA, but also of staying in the NBA and becoming all-stars. This is not a fluky, small sample size kind of deal either. It may not be the most complex analysis, but it's still 15 plus years of information with like hundreds of different data points. So with that in mind, it's time to ask the big question. Was this ever a good idea in the first place? Like I said a minute ago, this data doesn't necessarily confirm that younger players are better, but it also absolutely does not back up the idea that an older, more mature player is more likely to succeed in the NBA. The league made a huge commitment to this idea, fundamentally altering its rules and the rules of college basketball based on the assumption that that idea was true. But the data doesn't really support it, and not even 20 years later, one and done is in serious jeopardy. The NBA collective bargaining agreement expires after next season, and the lowering of the draft eligibility age to 18 is one of the key issues that the Players Association is going to bring to those negotiations. But how have we gotten to the point that the league might also be okay with this? Well, the things that David Stern said for years were alternative options to guys going to college are actually options now. Lots of high schoolers were jumping to the pros for economic reasons, but with the advent of the NIL rule in college athletics and the development of the NBA's G League, that isn't as much of an issue anymore. Anytime there's a big rule change like this, there are 3 questions we need to ask, and keep asking. Who is this helping? Who is this hurting? And how can we make it better? In one and done's case, the answers to those are pretty telling. In theory, it helped the NBA's teams by allowing them a greater sample size from which to evaluate top prospects and their performance against top competition. Did it work out that way? Maybe, maybe not. But as far as what could have made one and done better, it's possible that the best answer to that is just getting rid of it, or at least altering the rule so that it isn't quite so restrictive. Big organizations like the NBA are understandably reticent to backtrack on something they've put so much messaging and resources into, but I would argue that in the long term, sometimes the smartest thing to do is to change course, which they may be about to. In other words, it's okay to make a big change to the big change. And if nothing else comes from what's become a very lengthy discussion of one and done, I hope that's part of it. One and done brought us some of the most iconic moments in college basketball history. Without Derrick Rose going to Memphis, there's no Mario Chalmers shot to send that title game to overtime. There's no half-court buzzer beater against UCLA if Jalen Suggs never goes to Gonzaga. There's no 2012 Kentucky, one of the greatest college basketball teams of all time, without Anthony Davis and MKG passing through Lexington on their way to the NBA. It's a part of basketball history now, and as we've seen throughout this episode, one and done even has a kind of history of its own. Maybe on its way out, and that may be fine, because nobody really asked for it in the first place, but regardless, you can't talk about basketball in the modern era without mentioning those three words. Was that what the NBA intended? Probably not. But in all fairness, it was completely their idea. Hi everybody, thanks so much for going on this journey with me through the recent history of college basketball. This is one of those episodes that was really interesting to research because I got to do some serious guy remembering from all the different teams I talked about. If you're new to the channel, let me be the first to say welcome. I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game, a channel where we dig deep into stories about sports psychology and culture. Sometimes, like today, we go deeper than others, but for a topic that's as nuanced and has as many moving parts as this one does, that's just what's needed. If you guys want to, I'd love for you to put your favorite one and done team or player in the comments so we can keep this conversation going. But for now, that's all we've got for you. See you guys soon.